The Senate chamber was unusually tense that morning, the kind of tension that comes not from scandal or protest, but from the quiet anticipation that something historic might be about to happen. The grand marble columns and polished wood gleamed under the television lights, but the real electricity was in the air, a sense that the old order was about to be challenged in a way no one expected. Reporters lined the back wall, their fingers poised over keyboards, while staffers whispered predictions about the day's agenda. Most eyes, however, were not on the dais or the committee chair. They were on two women, Senator Elizabeth Warren, the formidable former Harvard law professor and progressive icon, and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a first-term representative from Texas, whose reputation for sharp legal analysis had begun to ripple through Washington. Few in the room could have predicted what was about to unfold. The hearing was supposed to be a routine joint session on the constitutional limits of executive power, a topic that, in most years, would have drawn little more than polite interest. But the political climate was different now. Recent executive orders had reignited fierce debate about the separation of powers, and the stakes felt higher than ever. The committee had assembled a panel of legal experts, including a distinguished Yale law professor, to provide testimony. Lawmakers from both chambers took turns questioning the witnesses, most sticking to familiar talking points or partisan jabs. The atmosphere was tense but predictable. Then the chair recognized Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. There was a subtle shift in the room. Some senior senators glanced at their watches, expecting a standard line of questioning from a junior member. Others barely looked up from their notes. But as Crockett began to speak, the energy changed. Her voice was calm, but carried a quiet authority that demanded attention. She didn't waste time on political theater. Instead, she launched into a methodical, precise breakdown of three landmark Supreme Court cases that defined the boundaries of presidential power during national emergencies. In Youngstown Sheet and Tube v. Sawyer, she began. Justice Jackson's concurrence established a three-tier framework for evaluating executive action. But what's often overlooked is how that framework evolved through Dames and Moore v. Regan, and later in Medellin v. Texas. She spoke without glancing at her notes, weaving together constitutional principles, historical rulings, and modern implications with a fluency that made even the most seasoned lawmakers sit up straighter. The Yale professor, who had just finished a lengthy explanation of constitutional necessity, looked genuinely surprised. The faint rustle of papers stopped. Attention returned to the front. Crockett continued, her tone unwavering. The question isn't just whether the president can issue these orders. The real issue is whether that authority flows directly from article to powers, or if it demands explicit congressional approval under Justice Jackson's first category. That difference defines how our democracy maintains its checks and balances. She didn't just recite case law. She built a powerful argument about the balance of power between Congress and the executive branch, refining the scholar's own position in real time. By now, the energy in the hearing room had completely changed. Staffers who had been half listening looked up from their screens. Reporters who expected a routine session started typing rapidly, realizing they were witnessing something rare. Even the most senior senators were visibly attentive. Senator Richard Blumenthal, himself a former Supreme Court clerk, nodded several times in approval. Senator Amy Klobuchar, known for her own legal sharpness, leaned toward a colleague and gestured subtly toward Crockett. Her admiration was unmistakable. What made Crockett's delivery so remarkable wasn't just her mastery of the law. It was her ability to apply those principles to real-world governance. She didn't talk in theories or abstractions. She showed exactly how constitutional structure should guide policy. When we evaluate these executive orders, she said, we must consider more than their stated goals. We must examine their structural impact, whether they strengthen or weaken the separation of powers that defines our republic. At that point, something almost unheard of happened. The expert witness himself began to shift his position. Congresswoman, Professor Harrington said with visible respect, you've raised an excellent observation regarding Medellin. I believe your interpretation of Chief Justice Roberts' Majority opinion highlights a limitation I may not have fully emphasized in my earlier remarks. The room collectively reacted. It was rare, nearly unprecedented. For a prestigious scholar to publicly revise his stance in response to a question from a junior House member, yet here it was happening in real time. As her time wound down, Crockett expanded her focus, speaking not just as a lawyer, but as a guardian of democratic principle. Our framers designed this system not to function only during peace or agreement, she said, her voice steady. It was built to endure conflict, partisanship, and deep division. The legal standards we apply shouldn't change depending on which party holds power. What matters is whether our government respects the constitutional boundaries that protect our democracy from overreach. When she finally stopped speaking, the silence that followed wasn't routine or polite. It was the kind of stillness that comes when people realize they've just witnessed something historic. Even the committee chair broke decorum for a moment, simply saying with quiet sincerity, "Thank you, Representative Crockett." There was no immediate transition to the next speaker, just a long, heavy pause. Even that silence spoke volumes, and then something completely unexpected happened. Senator Elizabeth Warren, who wasn't even scheduled to speak at that moment, raised her hand and asked the chairman for permission to speak out of turn. It was an unusual request that instantly commanded attention. Everyone in the room understood that when Elizabeth Warren interrupted procedure, something important was about to happen. The chairman, clearly surprised but respectful, nodded and gave the senior senator from Massachusetts the floor. Warren adjusted her glasses and turned to face Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, her expression calm but focused. The tension was palpable. Lawmakers leaned forward in their seats. Reporters froze, mid-typing. Everyone wanted to hear what Warren, a woman known for her sharp intellect and high standards, was about to say. "Mr. Chairman," Warren began, her voice measured but carrying a warmth rarely heard in her famously combative tone. "I've just witnessed something truly exceptional. Something that deserves recognition right now." She glanced toward Crockett and continued, "What Representative Crockett has presented today isn't just a set of questions. It's one of the clearest and most precise analyses of executive power limitations I've heard in all my years on this committee." The entire chamber went still. Elizabeth Warren, the senator known for grilling CEOs and cabinet officials without mercy, was offering open praise, and not just mild praise, but something that sounded historic. "I want to be absolutely clear about what we just witnessed," Warren continued, her tone now gaining intensity. "Representative Crockett just gave a constitutional analysis that rivals what I used to teach my third-year law students at Harvard, and she did it without notes, without hesitation, and with a clarity that frankly puts many of our colleagues to shame as she removed her glasses. A gesture she reserved only for her most serious points. The meaning hit everyone at once. "I've spent decades studying and teaching constitutional law," Warren said firmly. "I don't say this lightly. What we just heard was brilliant. Not brilliant for a freshman member. Not brilliant for a former public defender. Simply brilliant by any standard in any room." The effect was immediate. Senior senators who had barely paid attention earlier now looked at Crockett with newfound respect. Journalists who had been casually scrolling their notes were now typing furiously, realizing this was a moment that would dominate tomorrow's headlines. What made Warren's remarks so powerful wasn't just her political standing. It was her academic authority. A former Harvard law professor known for her mastery of constitutional law, her praise wasn't political courtesy. It was a professional endorsement with enormous weight. "The analysis Representative Crockett provided," Warren said, turning slightly toward the witness table, "especially her interpretation of how the Youngstown framework interacts with modern federalism jurisprudence, is not just technically correct. It offers a balanced approach to executive power that honors both democratic accountability and constitutional design." Then Warren did something even more remarkable. Instead of ending her comments, she began building upon Crockett's analysis, treating her not as a junior member, but as a peer. "If I may expand on Representative Crockett's point about Justice Jackson's concurrence," Warren said, "what she identified as particularly significant in our current context. The twilight zone of overlapping executive and legislative authority that Jackson described has expanded dramatically in recent decades. That's exactly the kind of constitutional ambiguity the Congresswoman so precisely addressed. This was no longer a routine hearing. It was an intellectual dialogue between two powerful legal minds, one a senior senator and former Harvard professor, the other a rising House member with real-world courtroom experience. The chairman, recognizing how rare this moment was, allowed the exchange to continue beyond the usual time limits. The discussion evolved into a detailed back-and-forth conversation about separation of powers, judicial interpretation, and modern governance. At one point, Warren nodded toward Crockett and said, "Her observation about how the Roberts Court has subtly adjusted the Youngstown standard without overturning it outright. That's exactly right. It's the kind of nuance that only comes from practicing constitutional law, not just theorizing about it." That comment landed hard in the chamber. Warren's words weren't just about legal interpretation. They carried a broader message about the value of practical legal experience. For years, Capitol Hill had been dominated by lawmakers with corporate or academic backgrounds. Warren's praise for Crockett, a former civil rights attorney and public defender, challenged the long-held bias that only certain types of legal careers carry prestige in Congress. Senator Dick Durbin, a Senate Majority Whip, nodded visibly. As a lawyer himself, he seemed to understand the importance of that recognition. Even Professor Harrington, the Yale scholar who had testified earlier, appeared taken aback. Trying to rejoin the conversation, he admitted, "Senator Warren and Representative Crockett have identified a tension in our separation of powers jurisprudence that absolutely deserves further scholarly examination." The expert witness was now trying to keep up with the lawmakers. The balance of authority in the room had completely shifted as this extraordinary dialogue unfolded. Jasmine Crockett's transformation was undeniable. She had entered the hearing as a junior member, one of many freshmen still finding their footing in Congress, but by the time this exchange ended, she had established herself as a rising legal force, respected not just for her passion, but for her depth of knowledge and intellectual command that few could match. Each moment strengthened Crockett's presence in the room. Staffers who had barely noticed her earlier were now watching intently. Senior members who might normally step out during a junior representative's questioning remained seated, captivated. The atmosphere shifted. The balance of influence in that chamber was being rewritten before everyone's eyes. "Senator." Warren closed her remarks with a statement destined to echo across news cycles. "I've worked with many brilliant colleagues over the years," she said, "but I want to state publicly what many of us have observed privately. Representative Jasmine Crockett represents the future of legal thinking in Congress. And that future is incredibly bright." The room erupted in applause, an uncommon breach of formality that the chairman allowed to continue. Fully aware of the historical moment taking place, Crockett rose with grace and humility, her response marked by the same poise that had defined her questioning. "Senator Warren's words mean more to me than I can express," she said, her tone steady but sincere. "Coming from someone whose legal scholarship I studied in law school, this is an honor I never expected. But what matters most isn't recognition. It's the fact that we're engaging in a real discussion about constitutional principles that rise above party lines. That's what the American people deserve from this chamber." That simple yet powerful response shifted the focus from personal praise to shared purpose. It confirmed that Crockett wasn't chasing applause. She was pursuing substance and truth. When the hearing returned to order, the energy in the room was entirely different. It was clear that Jasmine Crockett's standing had changed, not just among her colleagues, but throughout Washington. Senator Elizabeth Warren, one of the most respected voices in the Democratic Party, had just recognized Crockett as a rising intellectual force, and she did so not through political courtesy, but with genuine respect for her constitutional brilliance. The news cycle exploded. Within hours, clips of Warren's praise and Crockett's poised response were circulating across every major network and social media platform. The Washington Post ran a front-page story. "Warren acknowledges rising star." Veteran senator calls Crockett's legal analysis brilliant. The New York Times followed with a headline that captured the generational moment. A handshake across the aisle. Warren's endorsement of Crockett signals democratic evolution. Cable networks replayed the exchange on loop, while legal experts and political commentators dissected every line of their dialogue. Prominent constitutional scholars from leading law schools weighed in, confirming that Warren's praise wasn't based on politics. It was grounded in genuine legal excellence. Harvard law professor Lawrence Tribe tweeted, "What we witnessed wasn't just strong politics. It was exceptional constitutional reasoning. Representative Crockett's integration of textualism, historical understanding, and structural analysis demonstrates a depth of thought that transcends ideology." That validation from academia mattered deeply. It proved that Crockett's rise was rooted in intellectual merit. It's not media attention or party loyalty. The impact was immediate. Senior Democratic figures began reaching out to her office, requesting briefings and seeking her insight on legislation concerning executive power, judicial appointments, and constitutional oversight. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi soon appointed Crockett to a special task force on separation of powers. It's an extraordinary role for a first-term representative. It was clear that the recognition Warren had sparked was now becoming institutionalized, but even more meaningful was the cultural shift it triggered within the Democratic Party. Longtime lawmakers who had once viewed the younger, more progressive members with hesitation now began listening more closely. Senator Chuck Schumer cited Crockett's constitutional analysis during a press briefing, signaling that her influence had reached the very top levels of leadership. Warren, meanwhile, continued to champion Crockett publicly. In a podcast interview days later, she explained, "I've taught law and served in government long enough to recognize true brilliance when I see it. What impressed me most about Representative Crockett wasn't just her knowledge. It was her ability to bring complex constitutional concepts to life and make them understandable. That's the mark of someone who doesn't just quote the law, she shapes it." Warren also highlighted the power of Crockett's background. Her experience as a public defender gives her an invaluable perspective, one that too often gets overlooked in Congress. She's seen firsthand how the Constitution operates in real courtrooms and affects real people. That's a perspective our democracy needs more of. Her words marked a turning point in how Washington valued different types of legal experience. For years, corporate law and elite clerkships had been the standard of prestige. But after this exchange, the spotlight shifted toward those like Jasmine Crockett, whose work came from the courtroom, the community, and the fight for justice itself. Warren's remarks had done more than just praise Crockett. They had quietly challenged the traditional hierarchy of legal prestige in Washington. By highlighting the value of public defense and frontline legal work, Warren suggested that true understanding of justice often comes from those who see the system up close. Not only from those who study it, from elite offices or courtrooms. Her comments reshaped how people thought about preparation for leadership in government. For Jasmine Crockett, however, this new attention brought both opportunity and responsibility. She handled her sudden rise with remarkable grace, showing political maturity beyond her years. Crockett balanced humility with confidence, acknowledging her moment while keeping her focus firmly on the work ahead in her first major television interview after the hearing. CNN's Anderson Cooper asked how she felt about Warren's powerful endorsement. Senator Warren's words were incredibly generous, Crockett replied with calm sincerity. But what matters most isn't recognition. It's that we're developing a consistent constitutional approach to governance that can guide good policy, no matter which party holds power. When Cooper asked if she saw herself following in Warren's footsteps, perhaps running for the Senate one day, Crockett smiled and answered thoughtfully, "Right now, my focus is on serving my constituents and contributing meaningfully to these constitutional discussions." Senator Warren has shown how to blend deep expertise with genuine commitment to public service. That's the example I aim to follow, whatever position I hold in the future. Her response was perfectly balanced, smart, forward-looking, and grounded in service rather than ambition. It reassured voters and colleagues alike that her priorities were rooted in principle, not self-promotion. Crockett's growing reputation resonated with two important groups: legal professionals and younger voters. Bar associations began inviting her to speak at conferences. Law schools requested her as a guest lecturer. For a first-term representative, this level of professional attention was rare and reflected just how strongly Warren's praise had validated Crockett's legal credibility among younger audiences, especially law students and early career attorneys. Crockett quickly became a symbol of hope and generational change. Social media buzzed with admiration for her story. One viral post from a law student captured the sentiment perfectly. "Watching Representative Crockett get recognized by Senator Warren made me proud of my path as a public defender. It proves that this kind of work can lead to real influence and respect." That sense of pride spread across different communities that had often felt unseen in political and legal spaces. Crockett's rise, validated publicly by someone as respected as Warren, signaled that doors were finally opening for those from non-traditional legal backgrounds. Over the following months, the ripple effects extended deep into Democratic circles. The party began rethinking what legal expertise should mean in a modern democracy. Instead of relying mainly on former prosecutors or corporate lawyers, leaders started to seek insight from attorneys who had worked in civil rights, public defense, and legal aid. Senator Dick Durbin, chair of the Judiciary Committee, made this change official when he announced a new advisory panel on judicial nominations, one that would include lawyers from a broader range of professional paths. As we were reminded in recent hearings, Durbin said, "Exceptional legal thinking can come from many directions. Our understanding of the Constitution grows richer when we include diverse experiences in the conversation." 6 months after the historic hearing, the American Constitution Society hosted a symposium titled "New Voices in Constitutional Interpretation." Both Senator Warren and Representative Crockett were invited as keynote speakers. The event symbolized how the legal world was evolving, welcoming new generations and new perspectives into the national conversation on constitutional law. The symposium was packed. The audience, a mix of seasoned legal scholars, young attorneys, and students eager to witness the two women whose Senate exchange had become a touchstone for a new era. Warren took the stage first, her remarks both a reflection and a challenge. "For too long, we've defined legal expertise too narrowly," she said. "We've excluded voices that could deepen our understanding of how the Constitution actually works in people's lives." Representative Crockett represents this new generation of legal thinkers who are broadening and enriching that discussion. When it was Crockett's turn, she spoke with the same clarity and conviction that had stunned the Senate. "The Constitution doesn't belong to any one party, profession, or generation," she said firmly. "It belongs to the American people. Our shared duty across generations is to ensure its protections reach everyone, especially those whose voices have been ignored for too long." As she spoke, cameras caught Warren nodding in quiet agreement. That single image, mentor and protege, united by shared respect, became symbolic of a larger truth. A new generation of leadership was rising, not through competition or ambition, but through mutual recognition and merit. The Warren and Crockett moment had grown far beyond one hearing. It had become a blueprint for how political power could be passed responsibly, not by age or title, but through shared commitment to principles, intellect, and public service. As their collaboration continued, one message became clear: American democracy grows stronger when experience makes room for new talent. And when that new talent honors those who came before. The exchange between Elizabeth Warren and Jasmine Crockett wasn't just about two women. It was about how healthy democracies renew themselves through wisdom that lifts new voices that carry wisdom forward. In the months that followed, Crockett's influence only deepened. She became a go-to voice on constitutional issues, her opinions sought by colleagues across the aisle. She was invited to join bipartisan working groups on executive oversight and judicial reform. Her speeches on the House floor were now watched closely by both allies and skeptics, and her ability to explain complex legal concepts in plain language made her a favorite among journalists and educators alike. Warren, for her part, continued to champion the importance of broadening the definition of legal excellence. In interviews and op-eds, she pointed to Crockett's example as proof that the next generation of leaders could and should come from every corner of the legal world. Not just the Ivy League or corporate boardrooms. We need more lawmakers who have seen the law in action, who know what it means for real people, Warren wrote in a widely shared essay. Jasmine Crockett is proof that the future of American democracy is in good hands. The cultural impact was undeniable. Law schools across the country updated their curricula to include more case studies on public defense and civil rights litigation. Bar associations launched mentorship programs pairing young attorneys with experienced lawmakers. Even the media began to shift, with more coverage devoted to the substance of legal debates rather than just the spectacle of political conflict. For Crockett, the recognition was never the goal. In a quiet moment after the symposium, she reflected on the whirlwind of the past year. "I'm grateful for the opportunities and the support," she said. "But what matters most is that we're having the right conversations. We're talking about the Constitution not as an abstract document, but as a living promise to every American. That's the work I want to keep doing." Her humility and focus resonated with a new generation of public servants. Young lawyers and students wrote to her by the hundreds, sharing their own stories of overcoming obstacles and finding purpose in service. One letter from a first-year law student in Detroit summed up the sentiment. "Watching you and Senator Warren changed how I see my future. You made me believe that my voice matters, even if I don't come from privilege. Thank you for showing us what's possible." As the next session of Congress began, the effects of that Senate hearing were still being felt. Crockett's approach to constitutional law, grounded in real-world experience, open to dialogue, committed to clarity, became a model for others. Warren's willingness to recognize and elevate new talent set a new standard for mentorship and leadership in Washington. The story of Elizabeth Warren and Jasmine Crockett was no longer just a headline or a viral clip. It was a living example of how American democracy can renew itself. Not through division or rivalry, but through respect, learning, and the courage to lift others up. In the end, the moment that stunned the Senate became a turning point for a generation. Proof that brilliance, when recognized and shared, can change not just a room, but the very course of a nation.